Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this afternoon's presentation. Before the presentation begins, we want to make sure that everyone is aware that this event is being recorded. Both the recording and the presentation materials will be available later this week on the Port's 2023 budget and 5-year capital plan information page. We'll be adding that link into the chat. We will answer questions at towards the end of the presentation, and you should see a Q&A bubble in your Microsoft Teams app where you can add questions, and we'll be tracking those and answer them towards the end of the presentation. And to begin, we'd like to invite our Port of Seattle Executive Director, Steve Metrick, to start us off.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this presentation about your Port of Seattle's budget for 2023 and our capital plan for the next 5 years. The Port of Seattle is a special purpose government charged with creating economic growth through trade, travel, and commerce. From our airport to our seaport, our work touches your everyday life. We connect you to markets and customers from around the world. Our airport and seaport provide jobs for over 100,000 people, many of you and your neighbors. You travel domestically and internationally using our airport and seaport gateways. We are home to the North Pacific fishing fleet that puts seafood on tables, and our investments with cities and communities expand economic and environmental progress. Through it all, we promise efficient services, sustainable management, and equitable opportunities. More than ever, you need us to deliver for you. To get there, we need a budget that corresponds to our vision, goals, and values. Developing an ambitious but fiscally responsible budget in today's economy is complex. It's a tumultuous time. There's increased uncertainty about the economies of our top trading partners and inflation. Supply chain issues continue to impact our projects. As we add positions to increase our delivery capacity, we're being hit hard by people leaving the workforce for retirement and for other reasons, greatly increasing vacancies throughout our organization and putting tremendous strain on our employees. Despite these challenges, we anticipate a strong rebound in many of our key business activities that were devastated by the pandemic, resulting in revenues that will exceed pre-pandemic levels, but also activity levels that require this organization to be firing on all cylinders. When we reviewed these conditions and forecast, it was clear that investing in our workforce had to be a top priority. Our success depends on our people. That is why our proposed 23 budget will represent a larger investment in people and programs than any budget in recent years for the Port. We also propose the largest 5-year capital plan in our history. Investments in capital projects are investments in the future. At the airport and seaport, we intend for our gateways to meet the rising demands of today and a generation from today. Community investments are integrated throughout the Port. We're expanding our efforts in workforce development, economic and community-led environmental programs. And of course, we're expanding protection of the environment, creating new habitat, decreasing greenhouse gases, and cleaning up contamination. Although there's a lot of economic uncertainty about what 2023 balanced budget and 5-year capital plan, although there's a lot of uncertainty about what 2023 holds, a balanced budget and 5-year capital plan ensures that the Port can deliver results for local businesses and industries, our people, our community, and indeed the planet. As we all know, the budget is the expression of our values, and with the Commission's leadership, our commitment to serve the community as well. Thank you to our Port leaders for presenting the budget details this afternoon, our commissioners whose vision sets this path, and to all our participants. You make the Port stronger through your observations and partnership, and thank you for joining us for this afternoon. At this time, I'd like to turn things over to our Chief Financial Officer, Dan Thomas. Dan?
Thank you, Steve. We'd like to begin the presentation by reorienting you to the Port's mission and discussing the status of our pandemic recovery. As we go through the presentation, you'll see a few different ways how our business recovery matters so much to our overall financial health. Next slide, please. This is it. I'm sorry, back one, sorry. Our mission is to promote economic opportunities and quality of life in the region by advancing trade, travel, commerce, and job creation in an equitable, accountable, and environmentally responsible manner. While every year brings new opportunities and challenges, our mission and many of our objectives stay the same. On the right side, you see our 6th century agenda priorities. We recently added the last 2 about becoming a model for equity, diversity, and inclusion, and to be a highly effective public agency. And these objectives have endured for many years, and they allow us to carry through on longer-term priorities and planning. But every year during our budget development, we focus on shorter-term objectives, project available resources, and focus on responding to new challenges and opportunities. Next slide, please. Everyone on the call today probably understands that the economic benefit of the port's operations drives the region's economy. You see the economic value of Maritime to our region here. $16.3 billion in economic activity for international trade, $1.4 billion in economic activity for commercial fishing, and nearly $1 billion for cruise. Every Washington industry depends upon an efficient and well-connected port for access to markets. Hundreds of private employers operate at our seaport and airport, and they directly employ tens of thousands of individuals at our gateways. Our construction projects support an average of 1,300 full and part-time jobs every month. These are the jobs and businesses that make our region so economically diverse and resilient during an economic disruption. Next slide. Recovering operations was so important during the pandemic because operating revenues make up around 45% of our total sources of funds. And that's something that's unique to the port as a public enterprise. Maximizing our operating revenues is a cornerstone to our focus on fiscal stewardship. You also see that bonds, which include both revenue and general obligation bonds, play a major role in port funding. And something that might surprise you is that the property tax levy makes up just 4.1% of our total sources of cash. And we leverage that money into important projects, which we'll discuss later in the presentation. Next slide, please. Our operating divisions worked very hard to restore operations over the past year. We've made a tremendous amount of progress, especially after the International Arrivals Facility opened and international passenger volumes began to recover at SeaTac International Airport. We expect we will finish the year roughly 10% shy of our record-breaking airport passenger volumes prior to the pandemic. Our cruise business also posted a strong recovery this year. Cruise lines added more ship calls to make up for lower occupancy rates. And this led to Seattle actually serving more cruise passengers in 2022 than we did in 2019. So these statistics reflect a very strong recovery for the port. Next slide. The status of the recovery and how we will continue to deliver for people and the planet has been under discussion since early in the summer here at the port. In spring and summer, we held several study sessions with the Port Commission. We also maintain regular briefings on the financial performance of each division. And just this Tuesday, commissioners heard briefings on the operating division's budgets and 5-year capital plans. Our next step after the 2 open houses this week will be to introduce the budget to the commission on November 8th and for the commission to vote on November 29th. All of those meetings and presentations are available on our commission meetings webpage. So that completes my overview. Now I'd like to invite Maritime Managing Director Stephanie Jones-Stebbins to provide a more detailed look at her division.
Stephanie, you're
Thanks,
on mute.
Dan. Thanks, Dan. Next slide, please. I want to take the opportunity to, as I talk about the Maritime Division, first to share what Maritime Division is made up of. This is our waterside facilities, including our fishing business, our cruise business, our recreational boating business, a number of industrial properties that support those businesses, as well as maritime parks and a number of other things that support those businesses. And when we think about these businesses and running our facilities every day, Our priorities for the next year, I like to think of them kind of visually in this pyramid, which shows our safety and resiliency, our employees and our customers going home safely at the end of every day, our financial sustainability, ability to keep supporting our operations and serving our maritime customers is really the foundation of what we do every day. When we are able to achieve those things, we start to think about our future focused priorities, which we are doing in 2023, which include the things that we really need to do in order to be a successful business here in Seattle, which include focus on sustainability, a focus on equity and inclusion, being a business that everybody in our community not only feels touched by, but can envision themselves or their children working in. And then finally, innovation. In order to both grow, sustain a successful business and as well as achieve, especially sustainability, also equity, we're going to need to be really innovative. So innovation is really a key part of our future-looking priorities. If we are able to do all of those things, including the foundation of safety, financial, and customer service, as well as our forward-facing priorities of sustainability, innovation, and equity, that positions us to be a long-term, enduring part of the ocean economy to keep bringing that prosperity here to Seattle. Next slide, please. So going from that future focus of what all of our priorities are long-term, I want to talk about the budget specifically for 2023. Really, the bottom line is that we're catching up to where we were in 2019. Our revenues are up 11% from where we forecast we're going to be at the end of this year. We're really seeing both cruise occupancy as well as rate increases driving the most significant portion of that. And the same issues on our recreational boating marinas. We see both increase in our ability to improvement in our processes, which will drive some efficiencies and increase revenue. And then, of course, across the board, we do have rate increases. I want to talk about our expenses as well. Our expenses are up 14% from our 2022 budget and forecast. The big drivers in those expenses going up are, of course, the inflation that we see across our region. So as we both especially maintain our workforce and get back to some of the programs to support employees that were cut in the pandemic, we see that as an increase. We also have initiatives around equity, which I'll cover in the next slide, that do cost money. Our environmental programs are also, we are making significant investments in our environmental programs, and year over year, the cost of those programs is up about 50%. You'll see a little bit more information on that as we go. Next slide, please. So I want to take a second to talk about equity and budgeting. We've got a new, as part of our budgeting at the port, all departments and divisions think about equity and how their budget relates to equity. So just some of the things that we've implemented in our budget in order to move forward equity in the Maritime Division, including goals for outside services and contracts. So when we hire consultants and issue contracts for things like construction, we have a goal of between 15 and 20% of those business should be women and minority-owned businesses. We've included funds for parks to better serve communities. A lot of our parks are right along the Duwamish River in communities. These are great assets for those communities. We want to better serve those communities with our parks and engage our tribal governments and organizations in making sure they're culturally focused improvements. And this is based on outreach that we have done and will continue to do. Our cruise net operating income, which is up significantly, is targeted to outreach both women and minority-owned businesses to help bring those businesses into better opportunities in the cruise business, not necessarily with the port, but with our cruise line partners, as well as significant support for workforce development initiatives. We're budgeting time for our represented workers to participate in training and equity initiatives. We're including some budget funds to invest in work on eliminating and addressing human trafficking in the maritime as well. Next slide, please. Want to talk about the overall trends in the Maritime Division. I think that the key here is we go back to 2014. So you can see over the years that the bar chart is our overall expenses. The blue and green is what our operating expenses are, and that little gray bar refers to the cost to our cost for building our capital infrastructure. So when we build piers and docks and we need to pay for that, that's that ongoing support. And the dot with the line connecting is our revenue. So you can see that in the Maritime Division, we do cover our operating expenses, but at the moment, our revenues do not fully cover all of the investments that we need to make. Next slide, please. And this shows how our different businesses in the Maritime Division support each other. We have a broad portfolio of businesses. So some of those businesses, like our cruise business and our grain export business, have very positive net operating income, and that supports our other businesses like our fishing business and some of our industrial properties. So as a total, our net operating income is up almost $9 million from our 2002 budget. And you can see that really it's a balance between our different businesses. And we do, of course, think about what our appropriate long-term targets are for making sure we're funding all of the things we want to do. Next slide, please. You can't have a budget presentation without a detailed slide with really small font. So that is that's what this slide brings to us. More detail on our maritime revenues, and you can see, like the chart before, the graph before showed the difference. You can see that from our fishing businesses, our recreational boating, cruise, all have different increases since 2022. Biggest increases again are in cruise, which is up $14 million from 2022 proposed budget, and up, and our recreational boating business is up about 1.8 million from last year. Next slide, please. On the expense side, again, our overall expenses are up about 14%. Of course, that's more expensive to do business with inflation that we're seeing right now. But additionally, we're making pretty significant increases in environmental, in equity, we have funds again for park improvements. So all of these things are contributing to increased costs. We are adding 14 new employees. 5 of those are on our environmental team, and 5 of them on our team that maintains our assets across the entire waterfront in our maintenance division. And then a couple new positions actually to process grants and recover costs for work we do. Very important and also time consuming. Next slide, please. Significant investments next year in maritime, environmental, and sustainability. The overall budget is up 50% over 2022. And if we go to the next slide, I'll share a little bit of what some of the focus areas are. Next slide, please. So in our air programs focused specifically on air, we are making investments in a green corridor and maritime energy and energy efficiency, also looking at sustainable maritime fuels. We're making significant habitat improvements, including continuing with our Duwamish River People's Park, making sure that the habitat there continues to thrive and monitoring that, looking further into our plans for mitigation banking, adding octopuses to our habitat kelp program out by Terminal 91, and continuing with our blue carbon, Smith Cove blue carbon monitoring. A lot of cool programs here. that need funding to continue to support. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Dave McFadden, with the Economic Development Division. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thanks, Stephanie. Let's go to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about our division. We are a bit of a hybrid. We both have, you'll see that we operate facilities that generate revenue, but you'll also see that we manage a significant share of the port's community programs. And so this slide just shows, again, how we align to the port's top goals or our century agenda. And so you'll see down the left, the goals that were introduced early in the program, and then how our department, whether it's tourism or small business or diversity and contracting programs or real estate, all drive key metrics that are really important to us, but also to the community at large. So let's go on and get into more of the details. Next slide, please. Now, as Stephanie mentioned, equity has been something we have taken to a new level. Dan mentioned earlier that we added a specific goal on equity into our century agenda. Each department, each division was asked to take an equity lens to their budgeting process this year. And here's what are some of the results of our work in that vein. We have a new community business connector initiative. We're partnering with the Seattle Chamber of Commerce to provide additional outreach and technical assistance to BIPOC businesses and underserved rural businesses as well. We've added funding to support the growth of our Duwamish community partnership, and we want to see more active use of our community hub. We're adding an FTE to support our Women Minority Business Enterprise program. And we, in that vein, are also going to complete a disparity study. That'll evaluate how well we're doing in terms of sharing some of our supply chain opportunities with those women minority business enterprises. And then finally, through our tourism department, we're putting more priority on cultural and sustainable tourism projects, especially within our tourism grant program. So let's go on. Let's go to the next slide. In the numbers, here's kind of the top and bottom line. We do have an operating loss. Some of that is offset by some of our investments we make in community programs, but we're still up compared to last year's budget. We're also up on our revenues. We're seeing some bounce from some of the things like parking and our events and conference facilities. The drivers, as I mentioned, are again, that conference and event center, but also we're increasing some of our investments in equity, diversity, and inclusion. You'll see in our tourism slide, we've done a good job, I think, of promoting tourism recovery, but really starting to shift that focus to international travel and tourism recovery. And finally, an important thing across the port, as Stephanie mentioned earlier, is really advancing maritime innovation. Next slide, please. So here are the numbers. We're up 3.4 million or 18% compared to budget. Again, we're anticipating a return to really almost a pre-COVID activity level at Bell Harbor and some of our other event centers. Our garage is, starting to show some life and bounce from pretty soft times during the pandemic. And our leasing portfolio and all the properties on the waterfront are pretty steady. So that's the picture. Let's keep going. Next slide, please. And again, our expenses are up. Some of that's driven by increased activity. When we do more conferences and events at our facilities, it costs more money to operate those facilities and support those events. But we also see some increasing payroll costs, and we're going to continue those important community program investments. So, down at the bottom, you'll also note that we're adding a couple key positions to really pick up needed capacity in key areas. Let's keep going. Our diversity and contracting program, really your department focuses on the health and welfare of small businesses, but especially the women and minority business enterprises. And so the port passed a policy about 4 years ago to really triple the percentage of spend for women and minority business enterprises, but also to triple the number of those enterprises that do business with the port. So we've been on a march. We're doing very well there. We've more than doubled our utilization on many levels, but we still have another year or two of our 5-year program that we initiated with that policy. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to complete what we call a disparity study to just take stock of how those efforts are going and whether we need to do more in the future to make sure our supply chain is fair and equitable. In that vein, we do a lot of outreach and training. We want to make sure we're promoting those opportunities to work with the port and also providing the training in terms of how do you work with the port? How do you effectively bid on a project, and how do you manage a project if you get a partnership going with the port? That involves also a lot of communication, outreach, and training that I mentioned previously, and we work closely with our other public sector partners to advance WIMBY utilization. Let's go to our next slide. Tourism is really important. Obviously, we operate an international airport. Cruise is central to our maritime and our waterfront. So we want to do everything we can to support this vital industry. We're really focused on international tourism recovery, and we're going to work very closely with Visit Seattle and Washington State Tourism to do that. We've seen hotel occupancies rebound. We've seen cruise rebound also. We're seeing the statistics up, but we're also seeing a lot of that is flavored by domestic travel, that the international travel is still well below what we saw before the pandemic. And so we're going to take a concerted effort next year to really try and reverse those trends. We're also going to utilize our tourism grants to advance sustainable and cultural tourism events and destinations. And we're just coming out of, I think, what will be a really good conference tomorrow on responsible tourism that'll probably plant some important seeds in terms of more things that we need to do with other partners to just advance sustainable and responsible tourism, both here in Seattle, but also across Washington State. Let's go to the next slide. The biggest part of the Economic Development Division involves managing waterfront real estate, but also promoting and advancing real estate development. So we're redeveloping several of our properties, one of them down at Terminal 106. We're working hard on uplands facilities that I'll talk about in the next few minutes at Terminal 91. We also have an exciting Maritime Innovation Center project we're working on, and we have a tremendous portfolio, and we're trying to maintain strong occupancy across the waterfront. In addition, we've got some special projects planned for next year, some strategic planning with our airport and also with our Northwest Seaport Alliance. And part of our division's responsibilities is also to take care of our Pier 69 headquarters. Let's go to the next slide. And really, in the middle of that, we have an economic development and operational department that really makes a lot of investments in various community programs and partnerships. So as I mentioned, we've got a brand new partnership with the Chamber of Commerce, a Community Business Connector initiative, but we also support partnerships with cities, with chambers of commerce, with small business development centers, with Greater Seattle partners, and other stakeholders. We are an economic engine, and we need to work with our other partners to keep our region moving in the right direction economically. Next year, we're going to support a new small business export initiative in partnership with the SBA, Small Business Administration, Greater Seattle Partners. And we got a couple other initiatives, both with Duwamish Community Equity Partners and our Maritime Innovation initiatives that'll keep us busy. So I've covered a lot of ground. I think next slide, and I think it's time for me to turn it back over to Stephanie to talk about our capital projects.
Thanks so much, Dave. I'm going to talk a little bit about our capital improvement plan priorities across the entire maritime portion of the Port of Seattle portion of our waterfront. When we look at our 5-year plan and what capital improvement programs we ought to be doing, we're really thinking about achieving a couple different things. Almost half of our capital improvement plan is focused on asset stewardship, maintaining the port's capital assets. Could be buildings, could be piers, docks, things of that nature, really preserving Seattle's iconic working waterfront. And that takes a lot of investment. Our facilities are standing in the saltwater in all kinds of weather, and making investments to keep those in a condition to support our industries is a really important part of what we do with our capital program. We're also looking at programs that support community and environment. We are doing things like creating habitat, installing shore power so vessels can plug into shore power when they're here, making stormwater improvements, things of that nature. That's a pretty significant portion. It's about 20% of our capital program. And then finally, financial sustainability, investments that bring in revenues that can support the rest of everything else. That's also quite important. So I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about those projects now. Next slide. So as part of our budget, we look at a capital program for the next 5 years, from 2023 to 2027. And we will have, right now, we're projecting a $522 million 5-year capital program, which will be a record for the maritime part of Port of Seattle. So you can see on the graph on the left-hand side with the bar chart what the spending is projected to be over the years. And that covers a number of different projects, from large projects to keeping our fleet updated, and as I said, smaller repairs to docks, etc. But you can see how we anticipate that flowing over the next 5 years. And it's really across all of our businesses. Our on the waterfront, our two biggest investments, if you look at the pie or the donut chart on the right-hand side, you can see that our biggest investment is in our fishing and commercial and business, and we'll talk a little bit about what those projects are. In our portfolio management, which is our real estate and industrial properties that support all of this, a number of improvements there, as well as cruise, environmental, rec boating. We're going to talk now just about a couple of our biggest projects to give you a flavor of the kinds of improvements that we're focused on. Next slide. And one more slide, please. So I'm going to start by talking about a project out at Terminal 91. We call it Berth 6 and 8 redevelopment. This is really redeveloping the last timber piers at Terminal 91 and reconstructing them so that they can support the state-of-the-art fishing fleet. It's a big project. Even though folks may not know about it in the community, it involves removing existing creosote piling. It will be reducing overwater coverage. There's slopes rehabilitation and stabilization. Then we're going to put in a replacement pier with concrete piling, which is much better for the environment. Of course, we will also need to reconfigure. There's a floating pier and a boathouse which supports some smaller vessels. And we're upgrading the electrical supply and distribution so vessels can plug into shore power. The total cost of this project is $66 million. We're expect to complete the design next year and then complete construction about 2 years after that. So we anticipate construction starting in the end of next year. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn this over to Dave to talk about another terminal. We're going to tag team here. I'm going to turn it over to Dave to talk about another Terminal 91 project as well. Dave.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. As you move from the docks and you go uplands, you can see we have plans to develop some light industrial facilities, some buildings. And really, it takes advantage of properties we have owned for generations, and really drives projects forward that are going to support our local manufacturing community and our maritime industry suppliers. What we found in this particular area, Ballard and Intervay, is space is really tight. There isn't a lot available, and there's a lot of companies out there that are looking for space, whether they want to be close and serve the fishing industry, the maritime industry, or just need more room to make a product of some type. And so this is a great project. And again, our whole goal is really to provide that affordable space for local companies so that they can grow and be successful. Let's go to the next slide. Another project that we're working on is our Maritime Innovation Center. This is actually taking, I think, the second oldest building we own at Fisherman's Terminal and turning it into a brand new innovation center. It'll be a beacon for innovation, not just for the port, but for the entire maritime industry and region. We want to support incubation activities, research and development, and help companies accelerate. And what we found already by working with our partners, Maritime Blue, is there's a lot of energy in this space. There's a lot of great entrepreneurs that I think offer solutions not only for us at the port long term, but can really help drive and sustain our maritime industry, both locally and across the state. So we expect to really start construction towards the end of next year and then have it complete in 2025. So let's keep going. Next slide. Back to you, Stephanie.
Thanks, Dave. And the last project we're going to talk about, here is bringing shore power to our cruise terminal at Pier 66. So it's our first cruise terminal, and that's been in operation for a little more than 20 years. It's also a super difficult place to get this amount of electricity to. And our engineers at the port have figured out a very innovative solution after years of looking at how difficult it would be to get electricity to this location through downtown Seattle. And they are designing an underwater cable that will come from Terminal 66 through a duct bank and then through an underwater cable across Elliott Bay, come up at Pier 66 in order to provide sufficient power for a cruise ship. So we are actually have already in the process of purchasing the cable and electrical equipment with our with the supply chain issues that we're seeing around the world. Electrical equipment of this kind has a super long lead time, so we are procuring those things, and we anticipate being complete with design early next year, and completing our construction, beginning construction also at the end of next year and completing in 2024. So really an exciting project that's very innovative and really, I think, important to our overall goals of reducing air emissions and greenhouse gases. So I'm personally really excited about this project. And you see there in the picture, those are, there's not a, I don't know if you can see how big they are, but these plugs are really enormous. So it's a major project. And I am going to turn it over now to my, next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague with the Northwest Seaport Alliance. Melanie Stambaugh is here. She is the Director of Communication, and thanks so much for joining us, Melanie.
Excellent. Thank you, Stephanie. I'm glad to be here tonight to share about how the Seaport Alliance is working alongside the Port of Seattle. The Northwest Seaport Alliance is a marine cargo partnership between the Port of Seattle and the Port of Tacoma. We joined forces back in 2015 to better compete together to drive economic activity and job opportunities in Washington state. As you see in this slide, there's 5 Port of Seattle commissioners and the 5 Port of Tacoma commissioners that form the Northwest Seaport Alliance's managing members, which oversee container and break bulk activities and the cargo-related infrastructure investments in both home ports. Together, the Northwest Seaport Alliance is actually the 4th largest container gateway in North America. Next slide, please. Now, cargo volumes have been somewhat of a roller coaster over the last few years as the pandemic and subsequent supply chain slowdowns brought forward a variety of challenges for West Coast ports. The Northwest Seaport Alliance moves both domestic and international cargo, shown here as imports and exports. And These goods end up both here in Washington, and also import goods move all the way to the Midwest, to markets like Chicago and St. Louis. So it's a reminder that what happens at our West Coast ports actually impacts our broader national economy as well. As this chart shows, 2020 volumes dipped significantly and then rebounded in 2021. It was during this rebound that ports gained a lot of attention as news began highlighting all the vessels waiting at anchor to go to berth. I believe there were 60 or more vessels down in Southern California, and for the Northwest Seaport Alliance at our height, there were about 12 or 15 waiting to go to berth in Seattle or Tacoma. But I'm glad to say that today we do not have any vessels waiting to be unloaded at our docks. Instead, they can go right to berth, and operations are running much more smoothly. Instead, in 2022, it's been riddled with what I call, and what the industry calls, blank sailings, which have unfortunately reduced our volumes, and you'll see some variation from month to month. And we're working towards getting that to be more steady. These blank sailings happen when vessels actually skip Collier Port and instead head to another destination. To our north, the Port of Vancouver saw extreme congestion this year, which caused delays for them unloading to the north of us, and then in turn skipping the Seattle and Tacoma ports to just go back to their Asian home port to reload with goods. So we're glad that Vancouver has returned to a fairly steady operational level, and we're expecting our cargo volumes to smooth out in the coming month. Next slide, please. Now, I want to share from cargo volumes now to infrastructure that the Northwest Seaport Alliance has a few key projects underway that will benefit the Seattle area. First is Terminal 5, which is actually more than a $500 million investment between the Northwest Seaport Alliance and our terminal partners. You might be aware that Phase 1 operations opened this past January, and Phase 1 is the north berth there at Terminal 5. It is now operational with 4 super post Panamax cranes that are actually the largest right now on the West Coast. So since its opening, Terminal 5 has seen the largest ships in the Trans-Pacific trade. We had a 15,000 TEU vessel, which is actually the second largest vessel to ever call a terminal in Seattle. And that has made a few rotations here to Terminal 5, which is notable and exciting because we're actually in construction for Phase 2 at Terminal 5, where 2 more Super Post Panamax cranes will be coming next September. Phase 2 is expected to be operational at the start of 2024 and will be served by SSA Marine and have 6 operational cranes unloading and loading cargo to and from our port. Now, in addition to Terminal 5, the Seaport Alliance is also working on improvements to Terminal 18, the first of which is adding shore power to the terminal. Terminal 18 is actually the highest volume container terminal in Seattle. So by adding shore power to this terminal, we will have the greatest impact on reducing emissions for vessels while they're waiting there at berth in the Seattle harbor. Now, currently design work is underway, and our team is working with our federal and state partners to secure grant funds for the installation of the shore power capability. Additional upgrades to Terminal 18 are also being explored. These include dock rehabilitation as well as stormwater upgrades. Now, both of these are significant infrastructure investments, so it will be a few years before funding is secured and we're ready to move forward on construction on these projects, but our teams are certainly working to ensure that our terminals are able to meet the Trans-Pacific trade needs of the future. So the Northwest Seaport Alliance really appreciates working alongside our home port, specifically the Port of Seattle, to help drive trade and jobs in Washington. I appreciate being part of today's presentation, and at this time I'll pass it to Dan Thomas.
Thank you, Melanie. In our final section, we'll focus on the port's direct investment in the community, as well as the countywide property tax levy. So as a triple bottom line organization, the port is always focused on how we can expand opportunities equitably throughout our community. You can see here that we're budgeting a $2.5 million increase in community programs in 2023, largely driven by workforce development and equity programs. Many of these programs are fully funded by the levy. As we mentioned earlier, the levy makes up less than 5% of our sources of cash. And the port uses levy cash as well as general obligation bonds to fund a huge range of projects and programs that deliver direct benefits to our community. The levy funds capital improvements, some of which you heard earlier from Dave and Stephanie, regional transportation projects, significant investments in environmental remediation, and a host of community programs that are shown here. Now, there's a lot of information on this slide, so if you can go to the next slide, please. This one helps you better see how the port plans to spend about $19 million in community programs next year. Economic development initiatives make up the greatest share, but these programs also include environmental sustainability, workforce development, programs like the South King County Community Impact Fund, and equity initiatives like the Duwamish Valley Equity Program. This year, the port is also funding 2 new initiatives, an expansion of our partnership with the Seattle Aquarium to focus on both conservation and workforce development in maritime industries. And we're supporting a new program called the Community Business Connectors. Dave talked about this a little bit earlier. During the worst of the pandemic, small businesses, and particularly those owned by women and people of color, did not have equal access to support programs. We want to change that by developing community leaders who can help small business owners get access to resources faster, such as financing, marketing assistance, transitioning to digital sales, etc. And we're very excited to see this program take off. I also want to point out that while these community initiatives make a tremendous impact, we also weave sustainability and equity throughout the port's operating decisions and capital investment plans. So what you see here are the flagship programs and not the entirety of our commitment. Next slide, please. You saw on an earlier slide that the port uses the tax levy to fund many of those community programs. The port receives a very small share of the King County-wide property tax levy. Just about 1.2% of the total county-wide levies go to the port, which we then leverage into significant investments geared towards community needs and values. Next slide, please. So the Port Commission had gradually lowered the levy amount for about 10 years between 2009 and 2019. And in 2019, the Commission recognized the need to increase funding for growing capital needs and other strategic priorities. They adopted a plan that called for 3% annual increases in the port's levy over 5 years. And these increases helped put the port in a much stronger position to respond to the pandemic. For 2023, the port's preliminary plan of finance is recommending a 2% increase to provide the resources we need to fulfill our plan. And for the median homeowner, this is a very, very modest amount. Next slide, please. So this concludes our presentation. To recap on the timeline, we'll introduce the budget at the Commission meeting on November 8th. Commissioners will consider the budget for approval on November 29th. Next slide, please. And this presentation and other budget materials will be published to our 2023 budget and 5-year plan information page. You can see the link here, and it'll also be added to the chat. So with that, that concludes our presentation. And now we are ready for your questions. And you know, one thing that people may be wondering is, what about upcoming or the possibility of recession? There's a lot of talk in the media. Obviously, the Federal Reserve is ratcheting up interest rates in attempts to contain inflation. There's a big question about whether they can actually do that and engineer a soft landing or possibly tip us into a deeper recession. And I think they've recognized the fact that the port has weathered recessions in the past. Most notably the 2009 recession following the 2008 financial crisis. We have a lot of capabilities to revise our spending plans and trim our sales, reduce discretionary spending. So we just as over the pandemic, we were able to weather that pretty well. And I don't know, I would turn it over to perhaps Stephanie and Dave to talk about perhaps potential impacts on their businesses from a recession. And Stephanie, you want to start?
Yeah, you bet. I can start. And and before I do that, let me just also say that if folks have other questions, you can ask your questions by clicking on the question bubble at the top of your screen. So this is a great question for us to think about because, as you said, Dan, we've been certainly hearing in the news about the possibility. And I can say that the diversity of the port's business, I think, is a real strength when it comes to weathering a recession. We just saw through the pandemic that because even just in the maritime division, we got 5 different businesses, and our cruise business was totally shut down. But our fishing business and our recreational boating businesses really continued, so that having the combination of different businesses, I think, really provides some kind of protection against that. Certainly will be impacted, but we I think have the ability that, again, some businesses will do better than others. And one of the things of being a port, we're very conscious of the fact that we can be countercyclical. And so when things are in a recession, we try to keep making the investments we need to, for instance, in our capital programs. So just a couple of thoughts I have about that potential. And I'm going to turn it over to Dave and see if he'd like to add to that, and perhaps Melanie as well. Thanks.
Sure. As Dan mentioned, we have gone through these ups and downs before, so we have experience and leadership that can help us through these challenging times if they come our way. My thoughts go to the health of our tenants along the waterfront, and we do have some tools at our disposal. I just know that during the pandemic, when many of them were shut down by health orders, we were able to restructure a lot of leases. So we will go into our toolkit to help some of our partners stay afloat. And that same notion goes towards some of our small business partners. I think there's a lot of virtue in our new Community Business Connector initiative. That'll provide that intensive outreach and really take the pulse of these small businesses at a really important time and attempt to help them if they need help. And before we even set that program up, we went out and did a survey of small businesses and discovered and verified that they're actually facing more challenges as a result of supply chain issues, inflation, and finding workers now than they were in the depths of the pandemic. So those are the things I think about, how are we going to help our tenants make the next, overcome the next challenge, and how are we going to help some of our partners through these challenging times as well. Melanie, do you have any extra comments? Or
yes, I can share from a Seaport Alliance perspective. One thing that we've gained over the last few years with the supply chain challenges is a real resiliency and also stronger partnerships across the supply chain. And so if we end up heading into a recession, I believe that we'll need to rely on those strong partnerships that have been developed over the last 2 years. And also, we play a key role in ensuring that exports can get out from exporters here in the U.S. And as we look at ensuring trade continues, our commercial team works very hard to ensure that we can get exports out to other countries. And that will be a key part in helping to lessen the impact on our local ag exporters and also ag exporters from the Midwest as well. So we certainly recognize that imports drive our economy, exports drive our economy, and we'll do all that we can to bring folks to the table to ensure we can weather any storms. And certainly we've done so the last 2 years.
Okay, I've got some more questions here. I think the next one up was related to the City of SeaTac community relief funding that was included in our community programs. Those funds cover a number of different initiatives, but I would say the bulk of that really goes to support policing and security in the City of SeaTac. because of the airport located basically within city boundaries and the activities related to the airport really generates a lot of additional needs for policing in and around that community. So the lion's share of that money funds extra policing and security services in the city of SeaTac. Our next question is, what is the port's projected apportionment of IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, or the infrastructure investment funds? Do we have a clear idea yet? On the IRA, we're still looking into that. We don't have specifics. We think the bulk of those dollars will probably be available for various kinds of electrification initiatives, largely on the maritime side. A little bit perhaps at the airport, but we think most of that will fund those kinds of initiatives for maritime. And we are expecting some infrastructure investment funds. I don't have the specifics. I know there one of the airports, some infrastructure projects at the airport, some renewal and replacement projects will benefit from those funds, but I don't have the specifics. Any more questions? Please type them in the chat. Okay, looks like no more questions. So we really appreciate the opportunity to present to you all tonight, share a little bit about what's going on at the port, Maritime Economic Development and the Northwest Seaport Alliance. So thank you for your time, and please again, log into our website to get greater information or find recordings and more materials related to our budget. So thank you everyone, and good night.